Hi, I'm Christoph, and today we're going to make this water splash effect in Blender using Eevee. I wanted to make something that looks very smooth and maybe could compete with a hand-drawn animation. This is a long and advanced tutorial, but if you just want a short lesson, I recommend checking out the first 10 minutes, and this already leaves you with a splash effect that can be quite useful in your scenes. Like my other tutorials, you can find the source files in the description below. And without further ado, let's dive into Blender. Let's start a new blend file. Let's delete the cube, and we're going to add a plane. The first thing we're going to do is edit the plane, and we're going to right click on it and subdivide it. Then we can click on this little subdivide menu, and we're going to set the number of cuts to 20. Next up, let's add an empty, and we're going to pick a plane axis. And to see what we're doing, we're going to add a Voronoi shader to our plane. So let's add a new shader. Let's delete the principled, and we're going to add an emission shader. Let's add a Voronoi texture. And now we can at least see what we're doing to our geometry. We're also going to add a mapping and a texture coordinate node, and we're going to plug the UV into our vector. Next up, we're going to select our plane. We're going to add a modifier, and we're going to pick a simple deform, set it to bend. We're going to select the z-axis, and then we are going to select our empty as the origin. We're also going to set the angle to 360. And now if we move our empty, we can manipulate the center point. And now we have created a scene, and we're going to hide this. So let's add a mirror modifier and select all of the X values. And make sure that you move the empty so we remove the scene. And that's it for our geometry. We're now going to dive into our shader. So let's select our Voronoi, and we're going to do a classic Voronoi trick where we're going to make some hard Voronoi edges by subtracting two Voronois. So let's copy paste the Voronoi. Let's add the vector. We're going to add a matte node. The lower Voronoi we're going to set to smooth F1, and we're going to subtract it. And to see what we're doing, we can add a color ramp after the subtraction, set it to constant, and we can move our color ramp to get these hard edges. I'm going to set the scale to 7. And by playing around with the X scale, we can get this different effect. Either you can make it very round, or you can get this very radial effect. I'm going to set it to 5.8. And now we can also animate this. To do this, we go to our location, and we're going to add a driver. Let's go to the Y value and add hashtag frame divided by 100. And now when we press spacebar, it's moving from the inside to the outside. Next up, we're going to add a wave texture. And we're going to mix it in with our Voronoi. Let's also add a mapping and texture coordinate node. And we're going to set it to object. For the settings of our wave texture, we're going to set it to ring, to a Z value. And now what we're going to do is we're going to center this by playing around with the location settings. I'm going to set the scale to -0.6. Distortion I'm going to set to 3. Detail I'm going to set to 16. Detail scale is 1.5. And we're going to add a color ramp. And just for control, I'm also going to add a gamma node. And that way I can just slide this. I'm going to set it to 8.5. And now by sliding the mix node, I can add either more Voronoi or more waves. And now we want to animate the waves. We can do that by adding a driver to the face offset. Let's add hashtag frame divided by 3. And we're gonna also set it to a minus value. So set it to minus frame divided by 3. I don't think the center is completely aligned. So I'm just gonna tweak it. Yeah, that's it. Now let's play around with our mix. And that's starting to look like a really nice base. The last thing we're gonna do is we're gonna create a mask. And that is going to fade the outer edge. And we're also going to fade the center. Let's add a gradient texture. And we are going to set it to quadratic sphere. And let's just plug it into the same mapping node as we used for our wave texture. Let's add a mix RGB node. And let's plug in our gradient. We're going to set it to multiply. And let's also add a color ramp just to control it a bit more. We're going to set the white node in the middle. And then we're going to set 2 black nodes at the outer edges. I'm also going to add a gamma to my Voronoi. I'm going to leave it at 0.9. And let's set our gradient like this. And there's one more thing we need to do because this isn't large enough. We're going to add a mapping node and set the scale. We're going to set it in between this mapping node and the quadratic sphere. And we're going to set it to 0.5. And now when we press play, that's starting to look like something. We can play around with the outer edges. For instance, if I multiply it a bit more, I'm going to set my I'm going to set my color ramp right about here. Yep. And we're going to turn this into a transparent shader. To do this, we're going to add a mix shader. We're going to add a transparent shader. And we're going to plug our color ramp directly into our mix shader. And we're going to invert it. And now we're going to go to our material properties, and we're going to set blend mode to alpha clip. And shadow mode we're going to set to none for now. And that's it for our splash effect. We're going to add a plane to our scene. Let's resize it. And we're going to lower it. And we're going to add a gradient shader to this. So let's replace the principled BSDF by an emission shader. And let's add a gradient texture. We can set it to easy to get a softer gradient. And now we're going to add a color ramp. And we're going to select two types of blue. One is going to be more of a deep blue. The other one is going to be more of a lighter cyan blue. And we're still in filmic mode in Blender, so the white part of our splash isn't 100% white. So we can go to render properties and go to color management, and filmic we're going to set it to standard, and this gives a brighter effect. And now I'm also going to adjust the colors a tiny bit more until they're a bit more towards the green spectrum. And we are going to start making the splash upwards of the water. To do this, we're going to add a cylinder. Let's go into edit mode. Let's set it to X-ray. And we're just going to select the bottom part, and we're going to scale it until we have like this cone funnel. And I'm going to go to face select. I'm going to select the upper face, and let's delete it. Delete the face. And we're going to do the same with the bottom. Then we're going to select loop cut, and we're going to click in the middle, and this is going to prompt this little menu, and we're going to set number of cuts to 10. And this will give us some geometry to work with. And we're also going to set it to object shade smooth. And now I'm going to go back into edit mode, and I'm going to give this a bit more of a curve. So let's select our vertices, and if you click on this circle, it's gonna toggle proportional editing. And now if we select a section of our funnel and scale it, it's going to impact all of the geometry. So I'm going to create this little bell. and let's leave it for now. We're going to go to Add Modifiers, and we're going to add a Displace modifier. Let's click on New. Let's click on the Show Texture in Texture tab, and we're going to add a cloud texture. I'm going to set the size to 0.35. And now we're going to control the distortion by using an empty cube. Let's go to our modifier, set coordinates to object, click on the empty, and now our empty controls our modifier. I'm going to add a little timeline. You can click in the corner here and you can create a little extra timeline. I'm going to set auto keying, go to the first frame, and I'm just going to rotate this cube a couple of times around the y-axis. And I'm going to select both of the keyframes and set interpolation mode to linear. Let's turn off auto key. Yep, that seems about right. And now we're going to add a shader to our cylinder. So let's click on New Shader. I'm going to delete the principled BSDF. Let's add an emission shader. And we're going to add a gradient texture as well. Add a mapping and texture coordinate node, and we're going to plug in the UV. We need to turn our gradient, so let's rotate it around our z-axis by 90 degrees and set location to x1. And this is the effect we're going for. I'm going to add a color ramp. And I'm going to invert it. Next up, we're going to add some Voronoi. So let's add a Voronoi texture. Let's set the scale to 3. Let's add a mapping and texture coordinate node. And we're going to mix it in using a mix RGB. I'm going to invert it. And we're going to add a color ramp set to constant. And now if we move the color ramp, we can see the impact of our Voronoi. We're going to animate the Voronoi by setting our Z location to a driver. Let's set it to hashtag frame divided by 10. And we're going to invert it. We're going to set it to hashtag frame divided by 10. And now we need to invert it. So let's set it to negative frame divided by 10. This is the effect we're going for. And then we're going to add some extra little detail by adding another Voronoi. So let's just copy paste this. Let's add a mix RGB node set to soft light. Let's plug in our second Voronoi. I'm going to set the scale to 10. And I'm also going to scale the X to 3. And we're only going to add a little bit, just a bit of detail. And this is going to help us mask our shader into a transparent shader. So to do that, let's add a mix shader. Let's add a transparent shader. Let's plug our color ramp into the alpha. Let's go to the material properties and we're going to set both blend mode and shadow mode to alpha clip. And this gives this splash. And now we need to add some colors. And to do this, I'm going to add another color ramp. Let's plug it into our emission. We're also going to set it to a constant. And now we can create this division between the upper foam. I'm going to pick a light blue. And then for the foam, I'm going to select the same blue and make it even lighter. Let's tweak it a bit more. Yeah, this is what I want. And then we can add a bit more detail in the colored section by adding even more Voronoi. So let's add a Voronoi. Let's add a mix RGB in between our soft light and our color ramp. Let's just plug it in and add a color ramp. And now we're going to move the color ramp and we're going to play around with the mix. We can get this subtle effect and add a bit more detail. So let's press play. This is the effect we're going for. Now we can copy this splash effect, or better yet, we can instance it by using Alt-D. And now we can scale it around the Z-axis. We can make it taller, scale it a bit, move it up, and then we can rotate it around the Z-axis. Then we're going to click on our original splash again. Again, we're going to Alt-D and copy paste it. Let's scale it again around the Z-axis to make it more flat. Whoops. Let's put it a bit lower. And so we can get this cascading effect. You can also turn it around. And then you can also control the displacement of each of these by going back into the modifier and adjusting the strength. So for this lower one, I want a bit less distortion on it. And I'm going to make it a bit smaller so that there's less of a gap going on. I can also tweak the size of this animation if I want to by just clicking on our empty cube, set it again to auto key, and then we can also scale this to scale this effect. And so if I scale our two keyframes, I can get a different effect. Also, something you can do is to make this animation slower by going into the shader and playing around with the driver for Voronoi, and you can make it slower if you want to. And that's it for now. And now let's add the last part for our waterfall effect, and it's going to be a cylinder, and we're going to create this column of water. Let's rescale our cylinder, and let's place it in the middle of this splash. Let's set it to shade smooth, and let's add an emission. The first thing we're going to do is immediately turn this into a transparent shader. Let's do this by adding a mix shader, a transparent shader, and we're going to control the edges by adding a Fresnel and setting it as the input of our mix shader. Let's go to the material properties, set it to alpha clip. Let's add a color ramp. And now we can mix in a Voronoi texture. And this is going to create some jagged edges along our column of water. I'm going to keep the effect fairly subtle. Next up, we're also going to turn off auto key. Let's add a mapping and a texture coordinate node. And we're going to animate this column by tweaking the Z location. Let's set it to hashtag frame divided by 50. Okay. Next up, we're going to work on our color, and we're going to add two Voronoi textures. Let's plug in this vector into our Voronois. The lower one we're going to set to smooth F1. Add a matte node to create a subtract, and let's plug it into our emission. Next up, add a color ramp set to constant, and now you can get this splash or foam effect. And we're going to mix a wave texture in with this. So let's add a wave texture. let's add a mix RGB, plug it in, and we're going to set our wave texture to Z. And let's add some distortion to this. I'm going to mix it in using a screen. And let's add a color ramp. Let's tweak it to get a very subtle effect. And instead of a white, I'm going to use more of a gray. And now we can tweak the colors by adding a color ramp after our screen. We can set it to a constant. And I'm going to add 3 colors. One is going to be a darker blue. And then another one is going to be a slightly lighter version of that blue. And then this third color. I can play around with the different color ramps if I want a bit of a different effect. I'm going to make it a bit darker still. And I'm going to make the transparent effect a bit more subtle. And let's tweak the Fresnel. And let's also tweak our color ramp a bit. The Fresnel does make the shader disappear at certain angles, so you can always turn it off if you want to. But I'm using it at these angles, so it doesn't really matter. One last thing I want to do is to add a bit of the splash color at the lower part here, because I just want to fill in the gaps so that you don't see the dark colors here. And to do this, I'm just going to add a gradient texture, and let's mix it in using a mix RGB node. We're going to add a mapping and texture coordinate node. Rotate the Y by 90 degrees. And let's add a color ramp. Like this. One last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select the lower splash, and in our emission, I'm going to pick the same color, a lighter blue, as the one from our splash. And this is going to integrate it a bit more. Next up, we're going to add a little bit of detail to this lower section. And so I'm going to copy paste this splash. And I'm just going to move it out of the way for now. we move both the empty and the splash. And we're gonna unlink the material and add a new material. Let's delete the principal BSDF and let's turn this immediately into a transparent shader. So let's add a mix RGB, an emission node, a transparent shader node, and let's add a Voronoi texture. Let's plug it into the alpha. Add a mapping and a texture coordinate node. And we're going to set the material properties to alpha clip. And I'm not going to use shadows for now. And now we're going to set the texture coordinate to UV. Let's set the scale of the Voronoi to something like 24. And then we can elongate splashes by setting the scale of the X to something like 0.5. Also, we're getting these sharp corners because we need more geometry. It's a bit too low poly, so we can add a subdivision surface modifier and just apply it. And now let's add a color ramp. And now we can control the amount. I'm going to set the color to a darker blue. Let's animate it. Let's set the Y value to hashtag frame divided by 100. And let's both move our empty and our extra detail back in place. And let's move it below our splash. Let's make sure it doesn't collide. And I'm just gonna tweak the color ramp to just make it a bit more subtle. And also make the color a bit lighter, also to make it just a bit more subtle. And this gives some extra detail. As a last step, we're going to add a particle system. So let's add a plane. And let's add a meta ball. We're going to hide it underneath. And we're going to add a shader. Let's turn it into an emission shader. And this can just be a white shader. We're going to click on our plane. It's going to be our emitter. Let's go to particle properties and let's add a particle system. This is going to create a particle system. Let's set our N to 250. I'm going to set lifetime to 20. And in the render section, we're going to render it as an object. And we're going to instance the meta ball. Nothing happens. That's because we need to scale this. And also in our meta ball, we're going to click on the object data properties. And we're going to set the resolution of the viewport to 0.2. And we're going to scale our meta ball. Next up, click on our plane as an emitter. And let's go to velocity. Let's set it to a normal of 3. Yep, that makes it bounce. And then we're going to randomize it by also setting it to 3. And this gives this splash effect. And I'm going to scale this emitter. And I'm just going to hide it underneath our waterfall. And this is just going to create these little splashes. I just noticed I forgot to animate the wave texture in our column. So let's add it. Let's go to the phase offset and just add hashtag frame. And that's it. I'm also going to tweak this line by tweaking our gradient texture. And now last but not least, I'm going to add some bubbles. And now last but not least, I'm going to add some bubbles. To do this, we're going to select a cylinder. And we're going to use it as a particle emitter. Let's go into edit mode. Let's select the upper face. Let's delete it. The lower face, let's delete it too. Let's go back into object mode. And let's create our little bubble first. So we're going to add a UV sphere. And let's add a new shader. Let's turn this into a transparent shader. So let's add a mix shader, an emission shader, transparent shader, blend mode to alpha clip, and let's add a Fresnel as an alpha. Let's add a color ramp to tweak it. Gonna set it to shade smooth as well. And this is going to be our little bubble. Let's hide this underneath the plane. And now let's click on our emitter. Let's go to the particle properties. Let's add a particle system. And where it says field weights, we're going to set gravity and all to 0. And this is just going to create these bubbles. I'm going to set it here. We're going to go into our render properties, set it to object. And let's instance our sphere. And we're going to randomize the scale. Scale it a bit. Let's see what happens. Well, that's maybe too many bubbles. Set it to something like 100. Let's hide it in the foam. I'm going to scale the bubbles. And you can make them as big or as small as you want them to. I like this as some extra detail. And that's it. That concludes our tutorial today. For this final version, I added some shadows to the plane on the water, and I also tweaked the colors. And that concludes our tutorial for this week. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you like it in the comment section. Please subscribe, and see you next time.